is starting to take diversity and inclusion seriously. All over, terms and acronyms like DEI, EDI, welcoming workplaces, and belonging have started to pop into job titles, corporate goals and missions, and training resources. And like any societal commitment or change, one of the most difficult adjustments we make is to get a clear understanding of what the real definitions and meanings of these new terms are. They can make people get a little lost or sometimes have them looking in the wrong direction. And that's been what's happened with inclusion recently. In all the great talks we hear about diversity, equity, inclusion, belonging, accessibility, and justice, we're starting to talk in circles a bit, especially when it comes to inclusion. Now, I've been in the inclusion business for decades. I've worked with some of the most diverse populations, groups, individuals with vastly different needs and expectations at all levels of education, community, and industry. Inclusion is something that I really know, I understand, and am passionate about. And it's something that I see being overlooked and undervalued, even within this new commitment and engagement around diversity, equity, and inclusion. So don't get me wrong. A lot of the misunderstandings around inclusion are not intentional or dismissive. It's more like they're missing the point, and they're seeing the process of creating inclusion a little backwards. So let's start by actually looking at what inclusion is. Inclusion is about opportunities. Opportunities to be part of something, opportunities to have a voice, opportunities to bring your whole self to work. And inclusion requires belonging. Now, one of the most recent conversations around expanding diversity, equity, and inclusion, or DEI, is to also include the term belonging, creating DEIB. Now, this is something that's really just a misguided attempt to expand the reach of well-meaning efforts to create a welcoming environment. The problem is creating belonging is part of inclusion. And if you have it as a separate element, it speaks to the misunderstandings we have around inclusion and undercuts its extreme importance. Too often, inclusion is seen as the natural result of increasing diversity and equity rules in the workplace. Diversity plus equity equals inclusion approach. But that's wrong. Inclusion is not about inviting people to participate. It's about the entire climate of the workplace that diversity and equity require in order to be successful. By stating that you need to have belonging as well is just a different way of saying that you're unclear about the importance of inclusion and you don't really understand what it really means. So you have to add more terms and language in order to get to where you're supposed to be already. But if inclusion is addressed without belonging, then you're creating integration. And that's where people with different backgrounds work alongside each other. They coexist, but they're not necessarily seen or treated as equals. Having inclusion without belonging is like having diversity without representation. It completely undercuts the true importance and intention. Now, another really important point to make is that inclusion is not just about making people from diverse backgrounds feel welcomed. Inclusion is about everyone. Everyone needs to belong, to be seen, be heard, be welcomed, and be encouraged. This is really where most of the misunderstanding comes from. Inclusion is not just a DEI goal. Inclusion is a foundational element to workplace culture. All people, everyone, needs to feel safe and that they belong. Now, we have a video on how to create a workplace culture with inclusion as the critical middle layer. Here's a link to that video. And I strongly encourage you to check it out when this one's over. But if any people, employees, communities, regardless of what makes them the same or different, do not feel that they're seen, heard, and that they belong, then nothing will work the way it's supposed to. Any employee with any background will not be nearly as successful as they could be if they feel excluded or that they're an outsider. Any student who is not seen as a unique person with unique needs will not be successful if they're just a number or some random face in the crowd. Inclusion is about respect. It is pretty much just that simple. If you are not respected as an individual, then you do not feel like you belong, limiting your success. This is why it's a little disheartening when I see all of the great efforts that organizations are trying to make right now in committing to DEI. But then I see that they're totally misunderstanding what inclusion actually is. They're placing it as a byproduct of their diversity and equity efforts. Inclusion is required to make diversity, equity, representation, and accessibility actually work. The simple fact is inclusion needs to come first, period. As visible and measurable as placing priority on diversity and equity is, it's a fool's errand if you haven't made the effort to create inclusion first. One of the most common pieces of advice that I give to people who are trying to make gains in their company or workplace in regards to diversity, equity, and inclusion is to rethink how they understand inclusion's role in their workplace. We have another video that digs into that quite well. Here's a link to it. So make sure that you subscribe to our channel so you don't miss out on some of our other great videos. But the takeaway from this video is that I really hope you find it helpful to understand that inclusion is not just a DEI initiative or about integrating and inviting people to participate in their workplace. Inclusion is a foundational element to creating a productive and profitable workplace. It is the key to talent retention and is a primary function to creating belonging. Inclusion needs to exist for diversity and equity efforts to be sustainable. And it's something that we need to see as a standalone, essential factor in organizational and individual success. Because without it, we are just putting Band-Aids on the cracks in the foundations of our workplace and our society.